Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to talk about a very affordable, good value TerraMaster NAS solution. How many times have you heard me say that? Seriously, whenever I talk about TerraMaster, desktop, rack mount, any of their solutions, you always hear me say words like value. Pretty good for a cheap NAS, and you're getting good value for money. You always hear me say those things. In the world of network attached storage, I think there is a well-established hierarchy of the brands. You've got your Synology for your high-end software, you've got your QNAP for your higher-end hardware, and then you've got this middle ground that I talked about for years. We have all of these brands fighting over each other, and for a very long time, TerraMaster was always the brand I referred to when it was good value for money. Good value, they're good value, they are. But this is one of their solutions, this rack mount, the U8450, which genuinely feels like a complete business solution. And I still believe it when I say that this device, which we will open in a moment, is a lot of that. This is a good value for money solution, but it's a good value solution for business. And businesses generally, when you have any solution that is targeted at business and a solution that is rack mount, that generally means business tax. It is this label that gets applied to any solution when it has to be targeted at business. It has to have a high amount of durability about it, future proofing, upgradability, and ultimately, particularly when it comes to rack mount, it tends to increase the price by about 20 to maybe even 30%. And this seems to be a solution which, for the hardware architecture of an 8-bay with its inclusive hardware, and of course the OS as well, seemingly ignores a lot of that. And that's what I want you to keep in mind in today's review. But let's crack on. So, the U8450 knocks around for about £1,000. That's right, it's going to cost you about £1,000, which already I know a lot of you are thinking, well, that does sound like a lot of money. And you're right, it is a lot of money. But in rack mount circles, for a 2U 8-bay rack mount that's half depth, £1,000 for the kind of hardware we're going to talk about today in a turnkey solution, remember that's really, really important, is surprisingly low when most of the other brands cracking out this kind of hardware in a turnkey form, you're looking at minimum $1,299 upwards of $1,500 and more. Now, we've got our box of accessories. We've got the device itself in a frightfully large box. Pop that there, nothing else in there. Put that down. There. We have a little look at our accessories. We're already seeing that the device is arriving pretty well packed. I'm sorry about the microphone. Our accessories pack includes the following. We have a Cat6 cable there. Nice stuff. We have got inside our bag here, we have screws. We have 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch screws. We've also got rack mount handles and fixings, and of course a TerraMaster screwdriver. I've talked about those on the channel only about 1 billion times. You've also got your mains power. This is an internal PSU. Again, you would think that it's a rack mount, it should be a no-brainer that it's an internal PSU. All rack mounts have internal PSUs, right? Well, you'd think that, but TerraMaster did release a 1U 4-bay with an external PSU, which was one of my main criticisms of that device. Now, if we have a little look at what else we get, good bit of protective foam there. Move from there. Open this up. There's our first time set up an instruction manual. Again, the TOS 5.1 software arrives via a USB DOM inside and it's ready to go straight away. On top of that, it arrives with 2 years of manufacturer's warranty. On top of that, the device can run TrueNAS, Unraid. You can use that USB inside, pop it to one side, get yourself a USB drive with the Unraid boot and system operation and run it from that USB if you choose, or you can go ahead and run TrueNAS via TrueNAS Scala or TrueNAS Core. Use something like Rufus to create a USB bootloader and then load it onto an SSD. You don't even have to use the main storage base because there are M2 NVMe SSDs inside. I've spoken to TerraMaster about their position when it comes to using third-party OSs on their systems, and they're weirdly cool with it. Again, it will undermine a lot of your support from them. They don't encourage people to do it, but they're not deterring people to do it either. So that's something to bear in mind, because later on when I talk about the software and we circle back round to value, I think the support of third-party OSs on this is definitely worthy of discussion. But that's really it in terms of the hardware and accessories you get included with this device. And again, we are still talking about a device that at, standard RRP, if you go to their own website and outside of any sales, you're looking about £1,000 for this half depth rack mount. I say half depth, let's be fair, it's not a 30 centimetre deep rack mount. Here it is a 39 centimetre deep rack mount, but apart from that, it is a standard 2U affair there. So let's talk about the design in a little bit more detail. Now, as this is a rack mount, unsurprisingly, ventilation is going to be pretty key here. It's going to largely be put inside rack cabinets. So as usual, there is sweet F all ventilation on the top, bottom and sides. That's because all ventilation has to come through that middle bit there at the top. That middle bit there has got some ventilation there on the top part of the 2U. And of course, we've got ventilation throughout each of those little ports there across the hard drive bays. There, loads of ventilation, and the rear of the device has got 2 further ventilation ports there running all the way through, with a separate fan as well for the PSU there at the end, but also those 2 active fans there on the rear. Now, if we look at the build, it's a standard rack mount build there. They've not cheapened things. It feels pretty sturdy there. We've got that plastic peel that we can take off the top. If we have a look at the trays, they're not lockable trays, but again, that's up to you if that's going to be a game changer. There's no USB on the front, and I know this isn't a criticism for TerraMaster, by the way, but just generally at rack mount devices. Why have you stopped having USBs there on the front? It's something that was pretty common about 5-7 years ago, and now you no longer have USBs on the front, which frankly, in terms of interfacing directly with these devices, do make things really, really convenient. Yes, you can use your slide out rails, and there are no rails included with this, but front-mounted USBs do have a place for loading in specific applications or doing a local backup very easily without making your way to the back. Now, the trays are spring-loaded there at the top. It looks like there's room for a MUX, but there isn't. It is not a MUX connector there. It's just that additional ventilation throughout the tray. And there are screw holes for 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drives. Each of the bays inside, it's a combined data and power, but what I will say is they are still standard SATA. This isn't one of those devices that has combined SAS SATA there at the rear. It's still a clean setup. There's no loose cables knocking around. And overall, it's a neat little setup there for the individual drives, but I'm not going to turn around and say that it's reinventing the wheel or anything like that. You are still getting very much a standard 8-class, albeit shallower depth rack mount chassis there. Now, I touched on it earlier on. Not only have you got the 8 bays of storage, which by the way will support up to 20 and 22 TB drives, and bear in mind that not only can you get larger standard class 2.5-inch SSDs these days, but TerraMaster's support of their T-RAID or flexible RAID storage system allows you to use, for example, 4 drives on day 1 with a 1-disk redundancy, and use maybe 10 TB drives, and a few years down the line, as you start adding drives, thanks to it using a flexible storage system for RAID, it means you can add mixed capacity. So if on the first year you've got some 10 TBs and then later on you buy some 20 TBs, a flexible RAID storage system like T-RAID will allow you to take advantage of their larger capacities in a way that standard class RAID, your RAID 1, your RAID 5, your RAID 6, whatever, will cap all drives to the lowest available capacity. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about scaling this. You don't have to fully populate it on day 1. But on top of that, you've also got the 2 M2 NVMe slots inside. This is a Gen 3 architecture box, so those are Gen 3 times 4 slots for now, until we open it up and check. We'll have to double check that. But it means that not only have you got the main storage base, but you've got 2 NVMe's, which you can use to add M2 NVMe SSDs, which can be used for write caching, read caching, or as individual storage pools. And if you use them for storage pools, you can use it as a scratch disk for editing. You can utilize it for very high profile VMs. You can utilize it as a write buffer. There's lots of things you can use that extra storage for. And if you do go down that road of installing a third-party OS, so rather than using TOS and you want to use Unraid, you want to use TrueNAS, you want to use open source, but you don't want to go full DIY and get silicon paste under your fingertips, going for a pre-made rack mount solution like this and bunging on TrueNAS could be very advantageous to you. Now, let's move away from the design of this chassis, because overall I'm quite pleased with it, and let's talk a little bit more about the ports and connectivity, because with that, there's a lovely little surprise here on the back. Now, it's really the network connectivity of this device that will really blow a lot of users away for the price point in terms of rack mount use. As you can see there on the rear, we have got 4 network ports to play with, and we're going to get onto that 5th one in a moment. But at the end here, we've got our PSU. It's a 250 watt PSU. Again, even though it's a 1U kind of flex PSU, I would state that it's not going to be that easy to replace without a lot of unscrewing. It's not a slide-in module. Also, there's no support of a redundant power supply version, which again, at this price point and scale, isn't a huge surprise, but it is going to disappoint some users, given that a PSU is arguably one of the most fragile parts of any server. Now, we've got those fans with the RPM of those fans being completely controllable from within TOS. And in terms of ports and connectivity, we can see here that we've got a comms port here. That comms port is utilized for local console access now. So again, that's out of network access support. On top of that, we have got 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports here. So again, 2.5 GBE, meaning 5 gig if you combine them with things like SMB multi-channel port trunking, link aggregation. And again, that might be enough for a number of you, but then we've got 2 SFP 10 GBE ports to play with there. You hear that? 10 GBE times 2, 20 gigabit Ethernet, and a couple of 2.5 gig ports on this box. This is already an 8-bay half-depth rack mount solution with that flexible RAID and a couple of M2 slots. And now we've got a combined potential 25 gigabit network connectivity to play with. And thanks to having USB ports here, which can obviously be used for storage, but they can also support USB to 2.5G adapters. And again, within their OS, this is an x86 architecture box, but that means you can use 2.5 GBE to USB adapters to add 2 more 2.5 gig ports on this. You can even go, if you wish, for 5 GBE USB adapters. That means that pushes the potential network bandwidth of this box without a PCIe card to already 10, 2.5, 2.5, and then an additional potential 5 gig to 10 gig via 2 USB adapters. So that's an enormous amount of network bandwidth to play with. But then you may have spotted over here, what have we got there? That to me looks like a PCIe slot. Now, I will say, on the hardware specifications on TerraMaster's own page, I couldn't find much clarity on this. So in a moment when we take the lid off, one of the things I want to find out, other than those M2 NVMe lanes, is there a PCIe slot inside this device, or are they reusing another chassis? If it does have a PCIe, that opens the door to even more network bandwidth to play with. But in terms of connectivity on this, for that price point, because remember at the beginning when this was $1,000 and that sounded like a lot for the hardware, in terms of business rack mount hardware, this thing's an absolute steal at that network bandwidth, the connectivity on the external. Yes, there's a lack of any kind of visual output there, but notwithstanding, TOS doesn't really have a parallel HDMI GUI to play with. But on top of that, the CPU inside does not feature integrated graphics. More on that in a moment. Also on there, those 10 GBEs are SFP, they're not copper, which is going to annoy some. To that, I would counter 1. If they were copper-based, you would have to increase the price of this device at maybe 1,500. 2, SFP can be adapted using SFP to copper RJ45 adapters, which at the moment knock around for about 40 to 45 nicker if you shop around, which means you're not strictly limited to just SFP fiber if need be. And then, of course, you can only convert one if you choose to a copper-based port with an adapter and still use the SFP for long-distance 100 megabytes per second connectivity via fiber cabling. So you've got a lot of flexibility in what you can do. And also bear in mind that TerraMast has its own range of expansion devices via USB expansions, both in desktop and rack mount form, which means those USBs they're going to be used for that as well. So in terms of connectivity, I'm not going to say that this is, off the shelf sexy, but what I am going to say is, for the price point, that amount of connectivity is damn impressive. Okay, so upon removing that external casing there for this device, let's move that mic slightly there, you can see that the majority of this case is occupied with this rather modest modified ITX board here. Now we've got that big black CPU heatsink there, so no active fan, and that CPU heatsink is covering a C3558R Intel Atom processor. It's a quad-core 2.4 GHz CPU, no integrated graphics, and only 4 threads and 4 cores, so not out of this world, and it is, I believe, a 2020 generation CPU, but still nonetheless, for that price point, that's still going to run a whole heap of containers. It's going to run a few VMs, and it can run the majority of those business backup applications. But also that CPU, although it lacks a lot in the integrated graphics or cores department, it makes up for it with its PCI lanes, with the system having not only Gen 3 architecture, but 20 lanes to play with across the whole system there. Now that means that these M2 NVMEs, which are Gen 3, I see no indication of them being anything other than Gen 3 times 4 unless they're software locked down. I'll find out that, and hopefully the indicators on screen or the text at the early part of the video would have told you. But for now, I see no reason why they wouldn't be Gen 3 times 4 on this system, but we'll have to wait and see. Maybe they're capped to Gen 3 times 2. What I will say is the PCIe slot that we mentioned earlier on does physically exist. We can see the PCIe is connected, and I've looked underneath, and it is soldered and pinned in, and that's a Gen 3 times 4 slot. That's 2000 megabytes per second to play with. Now that CPU also allows up to 32 gig of DDR4 memory. We've got 2 slots, with the base level system arriving with 8 gig and it arriving with a secondary SODIMM slot. So again, a couple of 16 gigs, you've got 32 gig to play with inside there. There's a lot of things to like here. The CPU, although it's not going to be to everyone's taste, what I will also add is, due to that CPU having a decent amount of oomph and this MOBO clearly being designed for other large deployments, you may be able to make out here at the bottom, just there, that those silver ports there are SAS fan-out cables, and there's a third port that has been wired and soldered in. So those 2 cables there are going in to 2 multi-lanes there for each of the boards that have got 4 drives on each. So you have the option down the line, if you want to go a bit DIY and moddy, to add a further range of drives via a mini SAS cable there. And indeed, you have the physical space here to do it. It's just not an 8-bay device. If you wanted to factor in perhaps some 2.5-inch SATA drives, you have both the shelf here and the space and the input there. You just need to get the lane adapter to factor in those additional drives, something you may be really interested to do with a SAS fan out. Overall, I'm liking the layout. There is a shed ton of ventilation throughout this. Let's take this at a different angle. There is a lot of space there for those fans to be pushing all of that lovely air around this box. Again, I think there would have been room to add an additional PSU to go ahead with a redundant power supply version, but whether that was for reasons of market distaste in a device this scale having redundant power supplies, or just worrying about demand or changing their architecture, I'm not sure. But it's a shame that we haven't got a secondary PSU version. But apart from that, I can't really fault this layout, and I really expected there to be a larger board inside here, and that's quite a compact little arrangement for such a hulking NAS here for us to be getting on with. Ultimately, I like the hardware architecture, and as long as you stay within the price point that this is arriving with, it's a decent enough proposition to spend $1,000 on a business server with this kind of hardware bandwidth inside and out. But it's not just about the hardware, is it? So let's talk a little bit about the software, TOS, that this arrived with and the capabilities it may bring. And to the software. Let's be honest about it. TerraMaster, when it comes to their software, they make big gains. They've really evolved things very, very quickly. But it's not as evolved as some of the other NAS software platforms out there. Now, if in fairness, if you are looking for a GUI to access all of your data via the web browser, you want to deal with file management, you want an standard class operating system like your Windows and your Mac to actually deal with your NAS in a user-friendly fashion, it's still pretty darn good. Not only to support that flexible RAID stuff I mentioned about, their support of BTRFS, their support of snapshots, multi-tier backups as well, that range from using TerraSync to synchronize with local remote access NAS devices in your local area environment, LAN, or remote with RTRR, using USB backups as well, or you want to use Cloud Sync to synchronize this with existing cloud services. That is not only your standard Google Drive and your Dropboxes, but larger scale block level storage and larger bucket storage online, with support of a lot of first party tools for things like Mac, Apple Time Machine, and Windows based image wholesale backups to the system. But a lot of those are heavily reliant on third-party resources as well. And TerraMaster's range of first-party apps, although doesn't rival that of Synology or QNAP, are still reasonably good. It's just you are going to have a slightly less slick, smooth and hand-holdy experience than you find in the likes of Synology or QNAP. And they don't really have their own range of multimedia apps, but make up for it, as mentioned, with a lot of backup applications and raising the game a great deal more than they had in previous TOS version 4 that came before it. Now, they are one of the brands that were targeted by, successfully targeted by ransomware group Deadbolt. It has to be added. They weren't alone. Asustor, QNAP and a bunch of other non-NAS brands were hit by that same ransomware group using vulnerabilities that were found in Linux, something that so many things are built on and updates have to be tailored. Now, afterwards, how much of that was TerraMaster's fault? How much of that was users' fault in terms of not updating their firmware appropriately, or TerraMaster not policing those applications well enough? It's still going to be debatable there in comment sections and forums across the land. But I will say that since then, TerraMaster have tightened the door significantly on third-party apps that can be installed, the privileges that third-party apps can use, and even integrating that isolation mode that I talked about in other videos, where at just one click you can disable all third-party apps, all remote PHP access, all other user access, and basically streamline whole batten down the hatches style at the single click of a button that cannot be reinstated without a reboot. Now, again, as mentioned, you can ignore all of that and lump on Unraid, TrueNAS, OpenMedia Vault and NAS OS of choice if you wish. But TerraMaster's own OS is still pretty darn good. They've integrated an AI photo recognition tool. They've integrated lots more multimedia and backup tools for indexing the system, although, again, not quite as much as some other app developers out there have integrated and worked with Synology and QNAP. Same goes for the likes of iOS and Android. There aren't many TerraMaster apps. Well, the ones that are there are good, and their now new system management app is better than it's ever been. But still, nonetheless, when it comes to software, TOS, although has taken big leaps from what it was before, just bear in mind that it is somewhere between utilizing a lot of more polished applications and not having to use any GUI at all. And if you're someone that's coming from, again, to refer to Unraid or TrueNAS again, all those applications that are still, although they have GUIs, are still quite command line dependent, this is less so. You can enable SSH or Telnet in all you want, but it does find a middle ground between those two. And ultimately, if you're looking for an affordable, chewable user-friendly experience, TOS does have a lot to offer, but just keep in mind that the software isn't quite as graduated as some of the other brands out there that take a lot of the money they make from their products and put it probably more into the software than TerraMaster does. But for this price point, it's whether that is going to be make or break, do or die, deal breaker for you. And that's that really. The U8450, if it's not become abundantly clear in this review, I like it in terms of the hardware. Certainly, I really like how much they've crammed in for the price point and kind of challenging what the going price point for rack mount solutions should be for business. A lot of businesses don't come in to the subject of storage with a lot of prior knowledge, and it's very easy for them to get hit by the business tax. This manages to be an 8-bay 2U solution with 2 times 10 GBE on board, 2.5 GBE on board, a decent little file management processor there, up to 32 gig of memory, M2 NVMe slots, PCI upgradability unless we hear otherwise, 8 bays of storage that are expandable with a flexible RAID system coming in at under $1,000. I like that. The software could be better. It still could be better. And TerraMaster TOS software, as much as it's evolved, still has a ways to go. But if you are someone that's more interested in the day-to-day operations, file management handling, using third-party OSs, none of the AAA bills and frills applications, this may well be well for you. And if you're a business user that's not relied on a third-party hire as a system admin installer, and you're doing the research yourself, and you've come to this video because you're wondering why this costs $1,000 when the same level of hardware from Synology or QNAP goes $1,500 or higher, particularly with those 210Gs, that's the reason. You are paying more for the hardware than you are for the software, and that's the big takeaway here. Does it replace those other alternatives in terms of software? No. Does it combat them and beat them in terms of hardware? Hell yeah. And I think for you, I hope that's helped you choose what's the most important thing to you. Now, again, we're going to be utilizing this device and revisiting their Realtek RTD 1619B powered 1.2 series to revisit TOS very, very soon and see how that software has evolved. And if it hasn't already gone live, there are links to my full review of TOS 5 below to give you some idea about what that software can and cannot do. But overall, if you're a business user looking for a file server with a decent amount of in and out performance, this is a great choice. Just bear in mind that more affordable price tag is there for a reason. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, let me know in the comments. Apart from that, if you need some more help choosing the right solution for you, use the free advice section link below over on NAS Compares, big blue button on the right hand side of the page. Use the Discord or the Ask NAS Compares forum, or head over to Ko-Fi or Patreon for more expedited support options, our monthly Zoom seminars, access to videos in advance, and our content polls. And of course, to find out more about what's going on in the world of storage. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.